When I first met Jerrie Stewart, I was in awe of her, which I didn't know anything about her. But she was such an elegant woman. I just wanted to know, well, who is this woman? You know, and I think I might have said something to Elizabeth, who I didn't know. And I said, well, who is she? And basically Elizabeth said, just wait, you'll find out. And down the line, in the course of conversation, I found that Jerrie Stewart is a woman who has quite a lineage. And her lineage is one of the most famous in American history, actually. And it is a pleasure to have her come and talk to us about her family and her lineage. Coming to the table is an opportunity for people who were enslavers or whose families were enslavers, let me put it that way, and persons whose families were enslaved to actually talk to each other as peers with great honesty and humility. And in the course of, I don't want to say in the course of events because then I would be quoting somebody that we all know, that's a very famous phrase. But in the course of my relationship with coming to the table, I have just been so impressed over and over again about the, I don't want to use the word quality, but Thomas Jefferson said something at one point, and he talked about people being worthy. And I really feel like we are a sort of a operation that is worthy with people who are worthy. And so with that being said, I welcome Jerrie Stewart to our microphone. As I had told you, and I have said to her, talk about anything. We were glad to have you. You represent so much to us. I'm going to say it is now yours, Jerrie. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try to get through I have a presentation prepared, so I will take you through a few charts about my family and the connections and how I feel about some of that family, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. So I entitled this presentation, "Such is the Story That Comes Down to Me." And the reason I picked that title is because it reflects the oral history that has kept my family's history alive for at least 6 generations. And so I'm very honored to be a part of the family that carries the story forward. Whoops. Okay. So it all started with the oral history that my family had. It wasn't something that was written down and passed along to us, or something that you would even find in a book until recently. But I can remember my great aunt, my grandmother, and my mother always telling us the story to remind us about our 5 times great grandmother. And that was really the emphasis of the story. They were telling us about this great lady that was the matriarch of our family, and that it was our job to keep her memory alive. Her name was Sarah Hemings, but they called her Sally. And she had a secret relationship with a very well-known person that my grandmother insisted upon calling TJ. She never used his real name. So there were 4 children that were produced as a part of this relationship that survived through adulthood. But it wasn't until I was in the 3rd grade. I went to elementary school in West Virginia, and 3rd grade was the first time they gave us a real history book. And that was the first time I realized that TJ was somebody kind of special. It turns out that TJ were the initials of the third president of the United States. So I rushed home to ask my mother, is that TJ in my history book the same TJ that Grandma is always talking about? And she said, yes. So that was when I first realized the significance of the gentleman in the story. On the left, you can see a picture of the 4 generations of my grandmothers that helped provide the story. It's my great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother, whose name was Emma Jane Bird, my great-grandmother, who was Ella Mae Young, my grandmother, Emily Cooper, and my mother, Emma Jane Dole. So that is the only picture that I have that kind of ties the whole family together. Emma Jane Bird is the daughter of is the granddaughter of one of the sons that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had. And then, of course, there's the adorable picture of me and my sister and my brother, who got the story from my mother, who loved to wear hats on Sunday. And I was so proud 2 Christmases ago that my brother said he insists on always reminding his son of the story. So he's the only one in my family who has children, and it's his job now to carry the story forward. So Thomas Jefferson was known for quite a few things and became quite famous as a result. But 3 things were so important to him about his legacy that he actually had them carved into the monument that stands over his grave. And those 3 things that he was proudest of was that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, that he wrote the statute for Virginia on how religion was to be treated in that state, and that he was the father of and founder of the University of Virginia. So he was a very public person, but he had an interesting private side. In the Declaration of Independence, he tried to say that that all men were created equal. And it turns out what he meant by all men at that point in time were European descendant white men, and that they had certain rights that were granted to them. But the paradox was that he actually allowed for slavery to continue forward, and that 20% of the population in the United States at the time of its founding were people in bondage, and that what life was actually like for enslaved people in this early republic was something they didn't like to dwell on very much. I guess they didn't think it was good for their image. Thomas Jefferson talked about his views on slavery. In public, he would say it was a moral depravity and a hideous blot on our country, but yet he couldn't break away from the parts of slavery that made his life very easy and comfortable. And so that's why he tended to kind of shy away from being a total advocate for eliminating slavery. And it turns out he had some very good reasons why. Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people during his life across the 3 major plantations that he had in Virginia. And at any given time, he had over 130 people enslaved at Monticello doing the work for him there. During the course of his lifetime, he only freed 7 of his enslaved people, and some 20 others had run away and weren't really recovered. He also tried to come up with different ways on how you deal with the enslaved people, hoping that some of those experiments that he tried would ease his conscience a bit on why it was okay for him to own and sell people. Several of the Monticello people that had been enslaved were allowed to learn to read and write. And actually, his daughters were part of the process. It turns out that as they went through all of the records that he so meticulously kept about Monticello, there were quite a few enslaved families that he helped perpetrate at Monticello. And those families picked up last names, were allowed to have last names on their own. So across the course of history, those families eventually moved away from Monticello and are part of the list of families that are part of the foundation now. The ugliest part of what Thomas Jefferson did was he maintained meticulous lists of those people that he kept enslaved. And on the list that he had in his farm records, which he was notorious for, were the names of my 6 times great grandmother and her children, Sally Hemings, and the children that she had on the plantation with her. The other ugly part was that he did participate in the buying and selling of enslaved people. So it wasn't just him perpetuating the theme of families as he tried to do as a part of his experiment. He still had no qualms about breaking up families and selling off parts of the enslaved families. Oops. So the Sally Hemings story, as it was told to me, was that Sally Hemings's grandmother was a full-blooded African who was brought over on a ship by Captain Hemings, and they came to America. Captain Hemings, as a part of bringing her over on his trading vessel, got well acquainted with her and ended up having a daughter with her. Now, the African lady that he brought over was to be the belongings of a well-known Virginian named John Wales. And so this African lady was brought to John Wales's plantation. Captain Hemings did everything he could to try to get this lady away from Hemings, but from John Wales. But it was decided that Mr. Wales would keep her enslaved. The child that was born from Captain Hemings and the slave woman was a lady named Elizabeth Hemings, and she became enslaved on the plantations of John Wales. When John Wales's daughter was to leave the plantation to get married, he was sending along Elizabeth and the family. It turns out that Elizabeth, after John Wales's wife had died, became his concubine and had 6 children. One of them was Sally. And when John Wales's daughter was to get married to the well-known Thomas Jefferson, he gave Elizabeth and the 6 children to Martha to take with her as she moved to Monticello. And so that's how the Hemings became the property of Martha Wales Jefferson. When Sally was a very young girl, she was brought to the Monticello main house to help take care of Thomas Jefferson's 2 young daughters. And when they went to France with him as a part of him becoming the ambassador to France for the new United States of America, he had Sally come with his youngest daughter over on the ship to join him in France. It's not known for sure whether Sally knew exactly what was going to happen when she got there, but during the course of time while Sally was in France, she became intimate with Mr. Jefferson while in France. Now, when Sally was in France, she and her brother, who was also there as the primary chef for Mr. Jefferson, she and her brother could have made the decision to stay in France because they were actually free in France. You weren't allowed to actually own slaves in the country. But because her family was in the United States still, she decided that she would prefer to return home. But before she left France, she negotiated a contract, albeit an oral one, with Thomas Jefferson that said she wanted extra privileges and the ability for her children to be given their freedom at the age of 21. So those were the conditions that she put on their relationship if she were to return to Virginia with him. He agreed, and so she came. And she gave birth to 6 children fathered by Thomas Jefferson. 4 of them survived adulthood. Their names were Beverly, that's a gentleman's name, by the way, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. And they were freed at the age of 21 per the contract that Sally negotiated. So here's kind of a representation of what happened. An African lady had intimate relationships with Captain John Hemings as she came to America. The product of that relationship was Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings was the property of John Wales, who was married to Martha Epps. He and Martha Epps had one daughter named Martha Wales. After Martha Epps died, John Wales took Elizabeth Hemings and had 6 children with her, the youngest of which was Sally Hemings. Thomas Jefferson's relationship was always highlighted in various forms of the press, but never, ever admitted to by anyone in their family. So Thomas Jefferson got married to John Wales's daughter, Martha Wales, and they had 6 children, only 2 of which survived. It turns out Martha Wales died at a very young age. She kept trying to produce children for Thomas Jefferson. They kept dying on her, and it wreaked havoc on her body, so that she died very young. The 2 daughters became the wards of Sarah Hemings, Sally. And as I mentioned, when Sally came back from France, she had relationships with Thomas Jefferson that produced 6 children, 2 of which died at very early ages, one at birth, and 4 of their children managed to survive to adulthood. Now, as you can imagine, it was kind of obvious that Sally's children were of mixed race. And that all came from the fact that Sally herself was 3/4 white. Her mother, Betty Elizabeth, was half white. So the children that were produced by Sally and Thomas Jefferson were 7/8 white. So one would say they were definitely mixed race. It turns out in 1998, in order to try to once and for all kill the rumors about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, there was a DNA study done. Descendants of Sally and Thomas Jefferson's youngest son, Eston, were tested against descendants from Thomas Jefferson's relatives. It turns out that their DNA matched. Thomas Jefferson had a very unique Y chromosome in his DNA, and only he could have been the father of or if he had had a son, could have been the father of Sally's children. So it was noted as a result of those DNA tests that that he was almost assuredly the father of all of Sally's children. Two of the two oldest children, when they turned 20, almost 21, he magically gave them money and had them escorted away from Monticello. One initially went to Philadelphia, the other to Washington, D.C., where they passed into white society, never to be known as Hemings again. And as a matter of fact, we have no traces, even with all of the DNA testing that's been going on, as to who might be the offspring of Harriet and Beverly after they left Monticello. The other two sons stayed on Monticello because they were younger, and they were freed upon the death of Thomas Jefferson, but they were able to, they were freed at the age of 21 and stayed in the city of Charlottesville, waiting for Thomas to free their mother, which he never did. On the death of Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings was granted her papers, not truly a freedom papers, but granted papers to travel, so that she could stay in Charlottesville. The two sons took care of her in Charlottesville until she died. We do not know where Sally Hemings is buried. The two sons decided that for her safety and protection, they would never tell anyone. So to this day, we don't know where she was possibly buried. The two sons left after her death and moved to Ohio, where the youngest son decided that he would pass for white as well and move to Madison, Wisconsin. Only my 5 times great-grandfather, Madison Hemings, stayed in the Black community and raised the next 4 generations to be Blacks in the state of Ohio. Annette Gordon Reed has probably done the best documentation for the whole Jefferson family, and especially with relationship to the Hemings, and she has published a well-known book on the subject. I will show you later. So the DNA test really proved that all of the side conversations that people tried to have about where Sally Hemings' children came from were dispelled by the DNA test. And most of the family has kind of backed off of their denial that the Hemings were a part of Jefferson's offspring. So we, to this day, have some cousins that we get to hang out with. So to kind of summarize, there are legal historical references in all of the government records and farm records that Jefferson had that indicate the Hemings descendants were really his. The DNA tests in the late 1990s actually went a long way to prove that. And so we now have the super large family of descendants of primarily Madison Hemings, and Eston Hemings, who come together with our Jefferson cousins to meet at Monticello for all sorts of family reunions. The first family reunion was in 1999, right after the DNA tests proved that we were related. And so a lot of the Hemings family showed up for the family reunion, invited by some of our Jefferson cousins. That didn't go over well with all of the Jefferson cousins, however. Some of them rebelled and decided they would never let this reunion happen again. So other things have happened in the meantime. Because Monticello isn't actually owned by the Jefferson family, they decided that they would turn the whole theme of Monticello around. There's been a great emphasis placed on the 7 major enslaved families that lived on the mountain. So they've decided to invite all of the descendants of all of the enslaved families to come back for family reunions. And our Jefferson cousins that are willing join us. And so I've gotten to participate in 4 of these major events. Here are pictures of 3 of the family reunions that we've had there. So Sally Hemings' legacy, I think, is kind of important. It's what makes me really proud of carrying on this story. She was known as the youngest Black woman that we know of to negotiate a major contract with a very powerful white man that would improve her conditions and achieve freedom for her children. And that was something that was definitely unheard of in the very early 1800s. Madison Hemings wrote a memoir, as you could say. It was a newspaper article that he was interviewed for, and they captured his words in this article. In 1873, it was published in a newspaper in Ohio. And his famous phrase from there that I've borrowed for the title of my presentation is, "Such is the story that comes down to me." And that's how we, our family, has typically started telling our oral history as we pass it on from generation to generation. Now, according to Madison's memoir, Sally had first refused to come to Paris, and she decided that after negotiating with Jefferson, she would return. While she was in France, she learned to speak fluent French. Her brother was an excellent French chef, and so there was an opportunity for her to stay, but she decided to return. Now, my Hemings family, as Thomas Jefferson and Sarah Sally Hemings having children, the first daughter that they had died in infancy. The second was William Beverly Hemings, called Beverly. He was one of the ones that left Monticello at the age of 21 and married a white lady that Madison Hemings said they had at least one daughter that was raised as white. But once Madison said that his brother Beverly had left Monticello, he never had any more communications with that brother. So we don't know what happened to him, his wife, or his daughter. The second daughter that they had died in infancy. The third daughter, they actually gave the same name as the first daughter. Her name was Harriet. And Harriet left Monticello at 21. And as according to Madison's memoir, she married a white man of good standing. And we don't know if they had any children or where she ever ended up. Madison decided it was best to not try to track her down. She was able to leave and start a new life of her own. and that was the way it should be. Madison, who's my 5 times great grandfather, married a mulatto lady from Charlottesville, Virginia, named Mary Hughes McCoy. And they had 9 children that they raised as Black children in Ohio. Thomas Eston Hemings, who was the youngest, married Julie Ann Isaacs, who was also a mulatto. They had 3 children. As they lived in Ohio, the children were born, but he decided he wasn't cut for the brutal life of a former enslaved person. So he decided to move his family to Madison, Wisconsin, changed his name to Thomas Edison Hemings Jefferson. He added the Jefferson on the end, and he passed for white from there forward. So here are the children that James Madison Hemings had with Mary Hughes McCoy. My great great grandmother's name was Sarah E. Hemings, named after Madison's mother, Sarah. And she married a gentleman named Reuben Madison Byrd, and they lived in Ohio. I think you'll notice, I tried to put it down there, the one son named James Madison Hemings was one of the 9 who decided to go off and pass for white for many years. Now, Madison Hemings' legacy is one that I've really worked hard on to learn. He was born in 1805, but became a carpenter trained by his uncle, a Hemings. When he moved to Ohio, that's what he used to support himself while working a farm of his own. I learned early in 2014, I believe, that they had found a staircase in one of the buildings in this town named Warren, Ohio, Waverly, Ohio, that he had built. But before I could get to Ohio to see the staircase, the building burned down. About 6 months later, it was discovered in another building in that same town, a very, very similar staircase. And when they did a comparison between the pictures of the original staircase and the one in this second building, they were the same. So I did immediately rush to Ohio in the middle of a snowstorm to see this staircase in the tavern. I had to negotiate a bit with the owner of the building, but he agreed to let me into the hallway where the staircase was. He was impressed that I was actually a 5 times great granddaughter of the person who had built the stairs. It turns out Waverly is one of those cities where it's a sundown town, where everybody who was Black needed to get out of town before dark. So they're not very gracious to Black people there. I didn't know it at the time I visited, but the gentleman who owned the building was very gracious to me to let me go on the staircase and take pictures inside. Thomas Eston Hemings was the guy who moved to Madison, Wisconsin. His family didn't know they were descendants of a Black family, an enslaved family. It wasn't until the DNA tests were done, after they had been tracked down by the people doing the DNA work, and that's when it turned out that they were actually descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. So this whole family was raised for 4 generations, not knowing that they were Black at all. Sarah E. Hemings was the daughter of Madison Hemings, who married Reuben Byrd, and she and he had 3 children, one of which was my great-great-grandmother, Emma Jane Byrd. And she married a gentleman named George Edward Young. They had 12 children. that were all raised as Black. But during their adulthood, a couple of them took advantage of passing for white in order to get work. Anna, the second daughter, actually died at the age of 4 with her father in a buggy accident that killed them both. Reuben went on to marry Elizabeth Weaver. Now, Emma Jane Bird, who married George Edward Young. George Edward Young is a Scotsman who came over to Canada and down into the United States. She married him and they had the 12 children. My 2 times great-grandmother, Ella Mae Young, was their second child, the oldest daughter. This picture of the 10 children that survived to adulthood and is now in the Smithsonian because it is one of the few pictures that shows the descendants of the Hemings family. And this is also the portrait that every woman in my family had. It was passed down to us generation to generation, and we were told which one was our great-grandmother and that sort of thing, so that we could carry on the story. This picture came along with the oral history so that we could keep track of our family's story. My great-grandmother, Ella Mae Young, married a preacher named Robert E. Lee Cooper. They had 5 girls and 2 boys. My grandmother was the oldest, Emma Lee Cooper. That's a picture of her with the glasses and her first 3 children in the lower left-hand corner. Their youngest son, James Arnold Cooper, was the only one of their children who passed for white. And his picture is in the lower right-hand corner. Now, I remember 4 of the ladies in the picture in the upper right-hand corner. My grandmother is the one on the left in the back row. I remember the one next to her, my Aunt Nina. I do not remember Aunt Mabel. Aunt Esther is the one looking down, and Aunt Nana is the one in the lower left. I remember most of these ladies, and they were the ones who helped carry the story forward. To the point of where it was kind of exciting after doing all of the DNA. One morning, I had an email message from 23andMe that I had a new relative in my DNA list. It turns out to be a lady named Carol McCracken. Carol McCracken did not know when she took the DNA test and found out that she and her son, who took the test together, were part Black. She had been raised white by her mother, Anna Bernice Young, who is the lady in the lower left-hand picture. Now, the lady in the upper left-hand picture is my grandmother. They were cousins. I think they look an awful lot alike. Even their hairstyles are a little bit similar for the time period. But Carol and I didn't meet until 2014, and that was sort of virtually online because of our DNA test. But we arranged to meet at one of the Monticello events, which is the picture at the bottom of the page. That's she and her son that I got to meet in person at that Monticello event in 2016. We had managed to communicate across the course of those 2 years to stay in touch and arrange to be there for that event. It was always nice to meet new cousins. One of the last things I'll talk about is that in June of 2018, Monticello had completed the work on one of the wings of the Monticello estate. And in that wing, they discovered the room where Sally Hemings had raised her 4 children. I had an opportunity to go sit in that room where she had raised her family. I have to admit, I'm not a very suspicious person, but it was very eerie to sit in that room and listen to the words of her son's memoir being read as images of what might have been her family moved across the wall. The room wasn't very big at all. It only had one fireplace. It didn't have any windows, only a door. So it was quite moving to be able to spend some quiet time there alone with my ancestor. So I have a bit of a dilemma because I don't know how you rationalize an ancestor like Thomas Jefferson. You're supposed to respect your ancestors, where they came from, what they did in the world. And I'm really torn because I'm not sure I can love and respect a person like Thomas Jefferson. And there's always these tugging notions about, did Sally actually love him and have the 4 children, or was she coerced? It's hard to believe that a 16-year-old would make that big of a decision, but back then girls made decisions early. So I'm really not sure. And there was always the picture that Sally was the half sister of Thomas Jefferson's first wife. So she might have looked so much like her sister that he couldn't resist the temptation. I have no clue. But anyway, she went on to have a 37-year relationship with this man. So I guess I have to somehow figure out how to rationalize that. And that leads to how you deal with a story like this. My sister and I were asked by StoryCorps to preserve our family's oral history, and we did that on one of our visits to Monticello. I found out about the Getting Word project at Monticello after making a visit there, and am a part of that organization on how to preserve the history of the enslaved families that live there, and to support the activities that try to change the view of slavery in the United States. One of those events at Monticello is where I learned about coming to the table, which you heard about earlier today. And I've been working with them as a part of a sort of a truth and reconciliation kind of process to heal the racial wounds that are a part of our history, and to figure out how we might do better in bringing the country together in the future. And I really work hard at trying to learn about the history of the country, the real history of this country. My husband and I went on a tour of the Civil Rights Trail. We drove from city to state to look at the different places that are a major part of the civil rights history in this country. Until the pandemic came, my next move was to go to Africa, the west coast of Africa, where the enslavers picked up my ancestors. I'll have to wait until travel is much easier. And I've also included just a brief summary of Sally Hemings' story at the end in case someone might be interested. Oh, just a quick note. The picture on the left are the back stairs built by the Hemings carpenters at Monticello. Those were the stairs that the enslaved used to go tend to the rooms in the house. The stairs in the middle were the stairs at the Emmett House that burned down in Ohio. And it had the same curved railing that was in this back stairwell at Monticello. And on the right are the steps that I got to visit in the tavern at Waverly. And you can see the same curved steps with spindles in them that my 5 times great-grandfather, Madison Hemings, built at that tavern. And that's it. Let me see if I can get out of here. I'm done.